Welcome, Catherine Fisher, to this chat with Bookworms Wales and me, Simon Fisher. It's publication day for the Midnight Swan, 1st of October. So by way of introduction to the book, if people are not already aware of the books that preceded it, would you give an introduction? And I understand you've got a reading as well for us.
Yep, I can do that. Well, it's the third of a set. The first one, of course, was the Clockwork Crow, and the second one, Velvet Fox. So Midnight Swan is the third book, and the books are all about Sarin, who is a Victorian orphan, and her friend and ally, the Clockwork Crow. And the third book, I wanted to sort of wrap the series up satisfactorily. So the third book is all about how the Clockwork Crow finds his human shape again, and the difficulties and the journey they have to make to achieve that. I don't want to give too much away, obviously, but I can say that it's set at midsummer, so it's very hot, and there's a midsummer ball being held at the house at Place Bran. And of course, the Tylwyth Teg, are very anxious to attend the ball because that's their thing and they want to get into the house anyway. But meanwhile, Sarin is also worried about her position in the house and whether she's going to be allowed to stay there permanently. So she doesn't know what's going on. Something is going on and she's not quite sure, so she's quite anxious about that as well. So those are the threads of the story.
Yeah.
I'm going to read you a little bit from the middle of the book. So they set out on a journey to find the garden of the Midnight Swan. And on the way, this is one of the events that happens on the way, or part of it anyway. They're in a little wood, Sarin, Thomas, and the crow. The crow looked around in disgust. Well, I haven't a clue where we are. This journey is not turning out as it should. We might be miles from the swan's garden. Sarin said, I think, but that was all she had time for. Because at that moment, a rickety cage fell from the tree overhead and neatly captured the crow. He gave a great squawk and fluttered against its wooden bars. What the? Get me out of here, now. Sarin tried to spring up, but to her astonishment, she was caught too. A soft mesh, delicate as cobweb, had come down all over her and Thomas, trapping their arms and tangling their legs. And the more she struggled with it, the worse it got. Let me out, she yelled. But the crow had gone strangely silent. At last, breathless, she stopped shouting and looked at him. He was staring upwards. Sarin followed his gaze. The trees were not empty. 3 owls sat there. 2 were ordinary brown owls, but the central one was a huge snow-white creature with amber eyes. The crow drew himself up. What is the meaning of this? Atrocity. I demand to know. You're under arrest, the white owl said. Its voice was soft and sinister. Arrest? The crow was astonished. What for? Illegally impersonating a bird. But save your defense for the court. The owl swiveled its head right round. Take them, it said. With a flutter of feathers, 4 huge eagles swooped down from the trees. One took the cage with the crow in it, and the other 3 snatched up the corners of the net. Sarin gasped because suddenly she was in the air, tumbled together with Thomas being carried high above the trees. What's going on? He said. I don't know. Just hold on to the box. Keep your ears open and your eyes on me. But if he's been arrested, Sarin sighed. It's ridiculous. For being a bird, he'd hardly fool anyone. He's more moth-eaten than ever. They flew so high over the trees that clouds drifted around them. And then, just as quickly, they were descending. And as the eagles circled, Sarin wriggled round so she was lying on her stomach and could see where they were going. "Thomas," she gasped, "look." Below them was a vast ruin. It might once have been a castle. Now it was a mass of black walls and ivy-covered towers. And everywhere there were rustles and flutters and chirps. "It's full of birds," she whispered. I'm going to stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you. I feel
So,
very
yes.
privileged.
Thank you.
Like as if I'm having a personal reading there. Wonderful. Thank you.
So they have plenty of adventures on the way, one of which is the trial of the crow for being a bird.
I want to talk.
Yeah, I can't give the, but it all ends happily ever after.
And it is a wonderful conclusion to the trilogy, and the whole trilogy is set around Plas Avran. I was just wondering about Plas Avran and the surrounding countryside. In the first book, we see Sarin gets on the train and she ends up in a place called Treville, and there is a real Treville, isn't there? I just wondered how much of these, how much of the locations are real and how much are sort of imagined.
They're not real. I mean, it's just an imaginary mid-Wales, basically. Perhaps somewhere near Llandyssil, but I didn't have anywhere in mind. I know Treville is far away from that, so it was just a name I plucked out of the air. The house is based on a house I know, house where I went to school, in fact, and the grounds and the lake and so on. But as so often, I just plop the house down anywhere I fancy, and it just happens to be in mid-Wales, but it's not any specific area, really.
Aside from being resident in Wales, what is it that draws you to the landscape, and what is it about the landscape of Wales that is perfect for these magical settings?
It's difficult, isn't it? Landscape is the Welsh landscape is a very varied one. You know, it has hills, it has wonderful deep wooded valleys, it has loads of old castles and sort of buildings that evoke history. It has fantastic coastline. We have everything, really. So I think it's the variety and the strangeness of some of the places that really inspire some of the aspects of the books, and also the mythology and the legends that are attached to the landscape as well. And I also wanted, in this particular book, to use little fragments of language, of Welsh language as well, because the idea is she's put down in a Welsh-speaking area, essentially, and she's very interested in the fact that her name, Sarin, means star, which she didn't actually know before that. So I did want to bring in a little bit of the language just to, make it more interesting for people who don't know Wales, perhaps, or haven't come across the language before.
Mm. And there is that real landscape of Wales is also runs alongside a completely imagined other landscape, the other world. What is it that draws you to that side of the whole fantasy element of the Tylwyth Teg, and where does your knowledge of that come from?
Well, that's something that's fascinated me since I was small. Since I began to read, I read fairy tales. That was the first things I really read were fairy tales and folk tales, and I just read loads of them. And the more I read, the more interested I got. So I read, the Mabinogi and sort of Irish legends and Norse legends and Russian story. I just read as much as I could, because the idea of transformations interested me, and the idea of magic and how things can change without any explanation, how animals can talk. And the idea of the fairy land, is really interesting. The way that they are portrayed in various folk tales, the way that the fairy world and the real world are always really close together, and the ways between them are, there all the time, if you could find them. So they're through the wood or into the lake, or, into the barrow or wherever it is. that it's very, the two worlds are very close. And I think this is a very Celtic thing, to be honest, that the sort of the other world is always seen as extremely close to us and just through a sort of a doorway. So yeah, I like to, in these books particularly, I like to have the two worlds very close. So the idea is you can almost go into, into the other world at any time if you could find the way. So in the first book, Thomas goes down a stairway in his cellar and finds it, and of course Sarin in this book just goes out and walks into the woods. Basically, I think if you're looking for it, you will find it. She says. But I also wanted to bring out the sort of dangerous element, in the sort of fairy world. These are not, I think the Welsh fairies and the Irish fairies in particular are not twee little creatures with gauzy wings. These are dangerous elemental creatures, and you engage with them at your peril, really.
And what I've felt reading the trilogy is that that danger grows as you go through the three books. The books grow with the reader. Yes,
it's sort of grown with me as I've written them, really. And I think because I get to know the characters more, just as the reader does. In the first book, I don't know the characters that well. By book 3, obviously I do, and so does the reader. So we can both go on a more dangerous journey with those characters because we feel, comfortable with them and we know how they would react, I think. So you can sort of push it a little bit further, as you say.
Mm. And speaking of the trilogy, did you know when you started that it was going to be a trilogy? And what are the challenges of putting together a sequence of books?
Yeah. I didn't know. I thought I just wanted to write a book, a Christmas book, in fact, about these two characters that I had in my head. So it started off as a single book. It was very successful. And obviously there was a lot more I could do with it. And Firefly were very good and they said they would love to have a trilogy. So, it developed that way really into the trilogy. A trilogy is, you go through different problems with each book. So the first book has to set the scene and has to create the characters in the reader's mind. The second book tends to be a real roller coaster of fun. It's for me because, you're in the middle, you can do what you like. It has to be a complete story, but it also has to be part of the whole arc. The third book is always the most difficult because you have to wrap everything up satisfactorily. So you don't want the reader thinking, I want more. You do, but not in a bad way. You want them to think that it's all ended as they would hope it to end. And also, I had to get the crow back to his human shape as well. I had to work out how that would happen. So the third one is the most difficult usually.
I think one of the strengths of the book is Sarin herself. And strength is probably the right word because she very much knows her own mind. She seems to have a very strong sense of justice and of fairness. And indeed, in the Midnight Swan, she makes a quite selfless sacrifice. That seems to come from this sense of what's right, the right thing to do.
It is important because I wanted her to be very independent from the start. I mean, she's an orphan. She had to look after herself. So she's very independent, but she is very keen on doing the right thing. And because of that, she is a foil. She is opposite to the crow, who is not truthful, shall we say, and, a bit evasive about his past and very selfish in his ways, very vain, very always thinking about himself in a humorous and nice sort of way, I hope. But Sarin is the opposite. She's always thinking about her friends. She thinks about Gwyn, the servant boy. She thinks he doesn't quite get, as much as she does and feels guilty about that, I think. So she's very aware of the other people in the family and the way she needs to sort of be with them. And she's also keen on, solving the problem. She likes detective stories, as you know, so she's very keen on solving the problem of getting the crow back to his rightful form, and solving the problem of her own, you know, where she is going to live and who she is going to be, really.
Yeah.
But I wanted her to be a very strong character.
For many children, this trilogy will be an introduction to Catherine Fisher. It'll be the first thing that they've read by you. Where should they go next?
That's quite difficult, because my previous books are for an older age group, as you know, and when people ask me this, I tend to sort of direct them towards my very early books like The Conjurer's Game, Fintan's Tower,
Conjurer's Game.
Yeah, there you go. All of which are for sort of year 5, year 6 age group, and I've worked well with those age groups. So those would be where I would direct them. But I'm working on a book of short stories, hopefully, which will also be for this age group as well.
Excellent. I'll tell you what else I like, if I may. I really like this one. And I'm not sure whether people can get it, but it's a really fantastic little collection of stories. Yes,
it's out of print at the moment, and that's, as I said, I'm working on what I've been doing during lockdown. Actually, what I did during lockdown was to gather together all my short stories, including the 4 in that book.
Oh, right.
And make a collection of them, you know, which I'd like to publish fairly soon, of about 9 or 10 short stories, including those 4. And yes, some are new, some are old, some are strange. Well, they're all strange. And I'm hoping that they'll be the next thing I bring out.
Yeah, excellent. That sounds
the
brilliant.
The working title is The Red Gloves and Other Stories.
Excellent. That might be an exclusive.
It might be, yes.
When you look at your books, you say that, you know, you write for different age group. Is there something that links them together? Are there common threads?
Folklore mythology runs through everything that I do, including the poetry, and different sort of things, Arthurian legend, Viking stories, you know, and then sometimes I like to mix a bit of sci-fi in with the folklore. So the 4-book quartet that I wrote recently, the Chronoptica Quartet, mixes time travel with folklore, and that was really interesting to do because it was difficult to do, and I always felt that the 2 elements were pulling apart a bit, but I managed to hold them together. And so I like to set myself challenges like that, because as a writer it's very easy to fall into the trap of writing the same book or the same sort of book all the time. So I think it's really good to sort of set yourself challenges and make yourself write different things. That was one of the reasons I went back to middle grade to write these, because, you know, it's something I hadn't done for a while, and I wanted to sort of see if I could do it, see if I could still do it, and also just it means that the whole style of writing is much more pared down, much more less indulgent than in a sort of a young adult book where you can become much more complex. So it's a different challenge, really.
Yeah. Who inspires your writing?
Right, that's difficult because it goes way back, doesn't it? It goes, I mean, you know, think of all the people you've read in your lifetime. If I had to pick out people, I always pick out people like Alan Garner, whose books I read back in the 70s. Astonishing writer, really. Him for his engagement with mythology and legend, and the way he used it in a modern context in books like The Owl Service. Robert Louis Stevenson, I'm a massive fan of Robert Louis Stevenson. I think he was one of the greatest storytellers we've ever had. Books like Treasure Island and Kidnapped and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you know, these stories, just I lived with them as a child. I really find him fascinating. And then there are people like Tolkien, again, you know, somebody who can invent an entire world, an entire mythology of their own and ramifications of it. And Ursula Le Guin is another storyteller that I really admire. Robert Holstock, who really engaged with the British countryside. So these are the sort of writers that inspire me. And Arthur Machen, of course, my fellow Gwentian, whose books I started reading way too young and still read really a lot.
Excellent. Catherine, so thank you so much for joining me and on the release of the Midnight Swan, available in all brilliant bookshops now. A real treat.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.